Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you. My name is Tineke Oenema. I am the Executive Secretary of UN Nutrition, and it is my pleasure to be with you this afternoon and moderate this session on human rights, nutrition, law that are keys to transform food systems. So a very warm welcome on behalf of the organizers and on behalf of all the panelists. I'd like to ask you to, well, you're all muted, but all the speakers will remain muted unless they speak. And I would like all participants and attendees to type their questions in the chat functions, and they will be collected and they will be addressed by the panelists in the Q&A and debate session towards the end of this webinar, of this side event. So this side event is about transformation of food systems, and we really like to take this opportunity to promote human rights and the importance of human rights and law in order to transform food systems. We will also discuss the role of lawyers and other stakeholders to strengthen the legal framework, all to transform food systems and promote healthy diets. During the webinar, during the side event, we will be identifying legislation pathways for food system transformations and share good lessons and good practices from across many countries and regions in the world. So what we really would like to achieve this afternoon, this evening, this morning with you is to place human rights square and central on the global agenda. As UN Nutrition, we are doing that, for example, through a community of practice that we are doing together with many of the key UN agencies that are online with us this afternoon, because we see that human rights, law and governance so far has received insufficient attention in the global agenda, even when we discuss food systems, even when we discuss food security and nutrition. So bear with us. We'd really like to explain you that human rights and law do have teeth and do have the power to transform food systems. So that's my short introduction. Now I would like to invite you to listen to our two keynote speakers, Margaret Vidar from FAO, Legal Division, and Geneviève Parent from the Laval University in Canada. Geneviève, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tineke. So I want to thank the CFS for giving us the opportunity to provide an overview of the legal paper on transforming food system, which was authored by my colleague Linda Colette and I from the Legal Research Chair of Laval University, and developed under the guidance and leadership of Margaret Vidar from FAO that you'll hear just after me. So we are facing significant challenges, as you all know: world hunger, malnutrition in all its forms, environmental problems and climate change, as well as the tragic loss of agrobiodiversity and the loss of food diversity are among those challenges. So international organizations, scientists and researchers from different disciplines have reached at least two main conclusions. First, moving towards sustainable food is one of the most effective ways to fight human health and environmental problems altogether. Second, to do so, we need to address food security, global health, and environmental challenges through a food system approach. So in this context, the CFS and the international community were at work with notably the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition, and all the activities and publications surrounding the UN Food System Summit. Law can be an important transformative tool. However, it remains scarcely used and barely studied as a means to achieve the transformation of food systems. Therefore, through the study, we aim to build a common understanding of the importance of the law in this transition. The study highlights the nexus between human rights and sustainable food systems. It also provides an overview of a wide range of national guiding framework instruments and some national sectoral legislative interventions that already enhance sustainability in food systems. All of that within a food system approach, and also to give a first overview in order to pursue the reflection. Next slide, thank you. With this slide, we try to illustrate the levels of interventions of the law, as well as the three main functions law play in food systems. So in each of these levels, international, regional, and national, the law must fulfill at least three functions. First, the law should set out the fundamental principles and rights on which sustainable food systems should be built. Second, the law should act as a guiding framework instrument that coordinates and drives changes and induce changes across the food systems. Finally, the law should act as an operational tool within and across different sectors to improve sustainability and healthy diets. In the study, I'll just if you can go back, just go back, please, Margaret, thank you. In the study, we have focused on the national level, but this should not make us overlook the fact that international, regional, and national laws are linked. And without an enabling international framework, the ability of the states to develop clear guidance towards sustainable food system could be affected. And we also need to keep in mind that very local experiences can also feed the international law. In the next slides, we'll address the three functions of the law. So the first one was, as I said earlier, to set out the fundamental principles and rights on which sustainable food systems should be built. So human rights reflect a common understanding of an ultimate aspiration and a goal that states have set for the international community and for themselves. Their promotion and protection are a priority objective of the UN. We can then argue that human rights instruments, what they do is that they translate in legal terms the social consensus on which sustainable food systems should be built. So to that end, the study aims to demonstrate, as you can see, that the implementation of all human rights is generator of solutions in this transition, while being important drivers for the 7 cross-cutting issues identified by the CFS in the voluntary guidelines on food system and nutrition. And those 7 cross-cutting issues are presented in the upper part of the table. In short, the study demonstrates that human rights offer a universal framework to build sustainable food systems, and that the nexus between sustainable food systems and human rights is such that failure to implement human rights will hinder transition towards sustainable food system. My colleague Margaret Vidal will go on to discuss the other 2 functions of the law in sustainable food systems.
Thank you. I come from the Development Law Service of FVO, which provides legal assistance to countries that request it, and we undertake research and we collect national legislation. Now, with this slide, I just want to show you the sheer complexity of the legal frameworks around food systems. This is really just, it's not even comprehensive. This is what we have been working on in my service and what we think is relevant to food system transformation. Now, as we said, there are 3 layers to this legal framework issue: constitutions, framework laws, and sectoral legislation. On the constitutional side, which you will remember is what is legally binding and enforceable and should shape all other laws in a country and set out and constitutionalize the human rights that are at stake. Now, these are the ones that I've shown here are the ones that we consider the most important: food, health, healthy environment, and labor rights. And then on the other hand, the process rights like non-discrimination, inclusion, participation in the process of transforming food systems. The second layer is framework laws, which we think can be a tool to help shape the transformation and help coordinate the transformation of the food systems, and can set out the principles of participation, can set out a process and institutionalize what has been going on, for instance, as national dialogues in the UN Food Systems Summit context, we think that these type of framework laws, which have had some experience in many countries, especially in Latin America, in the context of framework laws on food security and nutrition. And we believe that these type of framework laws can be useful to keep the matters going, keep the conversation going, and keep the reforms within ministries going. Now, one of the key messages here is really that a framework law is just that. It should not be the substantive regulation of all matters. If we went back to the previous slide of showing you all the legal issues that come into, that should not all be crammed into a framework law, just some principles and a process. Now, of course, the scientific advice, the awareness raising, the consumer demand, the pressures that can be put to bear on all of us to change the food systems are important. But really, if you want to make sure that all parties, and I'm thinking especially companies, if they are going to be able to become more sustainable, then they need a level playing field, which means that there have to be binding laws and regulations that say what they have to do, because otherwise those that want to become more sustainable will be undermined and outcompeted by those who do not care as much about food security, about food system transformation and sustainability. I really think that this is a key issue, why we need also the sectoral legislation that is binding and enforceable to regulate all the elements of the food production, food supply chains, and food environment, which in turn can lead to better choices by consumers and affordable choice by consumers for that to happen. Now, let me just conclude by showing you again the study that we have been doing with the University of Laval. I really want to emphasize that we see this as a first step. We see this as our initial research, initial findings, and I think that there's still a lot of thinking that is going on in this question about transforming food systems. There's still a lot of questions unanswered about what is most effective, how could a country prioritize, what should you do first, etc. And I really hope that we will get some comments from people around the world, including the participants in this webinar, that will give us insights into how to shape a more definite legal study on food systems transformation and the legislative entry points for that. Okay, so that is me done. Participants, please remember that law can be an essential tool for transforming food system. With that, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Margaret and Genevieve. This was really, really helpful. You as lawyers showing the complexity of food systems, and also nutritionists often emphasizing the complexity of laws and food system and the topic, the issue of nutrition. So basically, nutritionists should become more legal sensitive and lawyers should become more nutrition sensitive. And that's exactly what this side event is doing. And our UN Nutrition COP is doing it, joining hands between legal experts, lawyers, and nutritionists to really make that food system transformation embedded in laws. Thanks for laying out the 3 layers of, the foundation done by the constitutions, and then the process, the keeping the machine running and going through framework laws, and then the nitty-gritty and the binding part of it in the sectoral laws. So that's been really, really helpful to explain that to all of us. I'd like to hear some considerations now from Katrien Engelhardt from WHO. Katrien is the Nutrition Policy and Scientific Advice of the Department of Nutrition for Health and Development. Katrien, over to you for some reflections.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stineke, and also a big thank you to CFS for giving us the opportunity to discuss this important topic. And I'm glad to see so many participants. So I'll just briefly in the next 5 minutes introduce food environment policies that WHO is currently developing evidence-informed guidelines on. And I'll provide a few insights into how human rights and equity are considered in the guideline development process. So as mentioned by the previous speakers, Genevieve and Margaret, the research they presented will help advance the role of law in transition towards sustainable food systems. And they highlighted that it represents an important first step in the process towards identifying effective legislative interventions. And the policy guidelines we're developing in line with the WHO guideline development process might actually be a second step to identifying those effective legislative interventions. They also mentioned that transforming food systems is all the rage, but that legislation is often not fully considered. So unfortunately, legislative interventions are not fully considered despite numerous calls and high-level commitments to implement legal measures to create health-promoting food environments and to reduce all forms of malnutrition. To name just a few, there's of course the ICN2 political, the outcomes of the ICN2, there are political declarations on the prevention and control of NCDs, including also the best buys, which are summarized in the Appendix 3 of the action plan for the prevention and control of NCDs, which actually makes specific recommendations on the use of taxes and regulatory measures under its third objective to reduce unhealthy diets. And of course, we now have the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition. So Margaret and Genevieve showed a slide that highlighted the main human rights underlying each of the 7 focus areas of the voluntary guidelines. And they included issues or focus areas like equal and equitable access to healthy diets through sustainable food systems. They included people-centered nutrition, knowledge, education, and information. That was that slide with the table. So the voluntary guidelines actually, they have principles that draw on the need to ensure human dignity, equality, non-discrimination, etc. And the focus of my brief presentation is actually the first principle of the voluntary guidelines, which applies to a systematic science and evidence-based approach. So developing evidence-informed public health guidance and setting norms and standards is a unique function and also a strength of WHO, including in the nutrition area to strengthen the evidence base on effective and safe nutrition actions to counteract the public health effects of the double burden of malnutrition. So this is the slide that Margaret and Genevieve showed. It's a bit blurred. It's a bit blurred because I want to highlight these 4 areas. So in line with these focus areas of the voluntary guidelines of CFS, WHO is developing 4 policy guidelines, namely on fiscal policies to promote healthy diets, school food and nutrition policies that focus on the creation of healthy school food environments, the implementation of food marketing policies to protect all children from the harmful impact of food marketing, and to implement nutrition labeling policies to protect consumers from misleading, deceptive labeling to ensure truthful and understandable labeling. So importantly, these guidelines, they are linked to the CFS voluntary type targets. And also these guidelines are in line with the WHO guideline development process. And when WHO develops guidelines, they must reflect the core value of WHO, which is the right to health. And the guideline development process also requires to consider not only the effectiveness of such policies, of such legislative interventions on defined health or non-health outcomes, but also to consider so-called contextual factors that influence or also are influenced by implementing these food environment policy areas. So 2 of the contextual factors are human rights and equity. And for the guidelines under development, extensive reviews of these contextual factors were conducted to support the guideline development process. And this information is used to support the guideline development group, which is a group of external experts whose central task is to formulate recommendations taking into account the benefits, the harms, values of the specific policy, the resource implications, feasibility, acceptability of the policy, and importantly, also the impact of the policy on human rights and equity. And I'll just show one last slide to show you how this information is used. This is a bit busy. So during the guideline development group meetings, the evidence on effectiveness of implementing the policies is reviewed and discussed. And importantly, a judgment is made on its desirable and undesirable effects. And the guideline development group members, they balance the effects, looking at both benefits and harms. So the group also reviews available evidence on the resources required, as mentioned, from the perspective of governments, importantly. And they also review information on the potential impact of implementing the policy on human rights and equity. And then looking at this, the group makes a judgment that contributes to the strength of the recommendation and also to the formulation of the recommendation. So from this slide, if a lot of the judgments are on the right side, including the impact on equity and human rights, the group can make a recommendation which is strong, even if the certainty of evidence on the effectiveness of a specific policy is very low. So this is just to say that it's important to consider the effectiveness, of course, of policies, but importantly also the contextual factors. So I'll stop with just two key messages. So the forthcoming guidelines might further support countries to identify legislative actions that consider human rights and equity. And it's important to acknowledge that many countries have already taken action to create health promoting and healthy food environments, which we'll hear from in a little while. And through these policy guidelines, we may be able to advance the role of law in the transition towards sustainable food systems. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Katrien, and thanks for highlighting the normative role from WHO and also FAO, of course, has a normative function, and highlighting how that works across the voluntary guidelines from that were formulated through the Committee on World Food Security. It really helps to see how WHO is placing the several work areas across those guidelines to see how that can be done, how that is being done in support of transformation of food systems. We have exactly 1 minute for a burning question, and I take the liberty of selecting one I saw in the chat so far, and I'd like to direct that to either Margaret or Geneviève. There was a question about what is the right to, is there a right to healthy diets or right to nutritious food? Can you say something maybe about that with regard to the actual right we have? Margaret, you want to take it? Go.
Yes, I'll be delighted. In the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, we have the right to adequate food. And that is understood that the food should be nutritious, should be safe, and by implication that diet should be healthy. Now, nutrition is not mentioned as such in that covenant, but it is mentioned in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I think by implication and by looking at the combination of the right to health and the right to adequate food, we have a very solid basis for a right to nutrition. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. I love it. I wish I could have that same articulated expression of exactly the right to food, the right to adequate food, we should say. So thanks a lot, and we'll get back to you obviously as in the general debate. Now I would like to introduce the panel, and I'm delighted to say that we have found 5 panelists from across the world representing Latin America, Sri Lanka, India, and Kenya and Uganda. So I'm very proud that the organizers were able to assemble such a rich group of people, I would say. So I'd like to start off with Mr. Juan Carlos Garcia Ciboya in the FAO Right to Food. He is the FAO Right to Food team leader already since 2012. Mr. Juan Carlos, I'd like to ask you, in Latin America, what have been the main advantages and challenges with using framework laws, so that's that second level law, on food security and nutrition or the right to food? Do you have some good examples? And I'll invite you to take about 2 or 3 minutes for your answer, please. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Stineke. I've been following Latin American region for the last 15 years. And this is my comment is based on my experiences. It doesn't represent a formal FAO position. It's just my experience that I will try to summarize. In Latin America, there was a movement that was partially based on the approval of the voluntary guidelines on right to food, right to adequate food in 2004, that led to a lot of national processes around right to food, food security, nutrition, and food sovereignty. Many of them finally produce framework laws. Others maybe produce a draft that was not successfully passed through the parliament, but also produce a lot of national dialogues. And the product of those dialogues is that in the region, there was a big change in terms of improving the enabling environment to develop policies, allocation of resources, increase the participation of the different stakeholders in the decision making, and also adoption of responsibilities by the different stakeholders in the governmental sphere, in the state. At the beginning, food security and nutrition, it was a responsibility in the agenda of the first ladies. If you wanted to talk about food security and nutrition, then you finally find you talking to the office of the first lady. Today, this is part of the parliamentarian agenda. And what is more important is there is a conversation between the different sectors in the government. They realize they have to work together. They have mechanisms to work together. Of course, this was not easy, and it has not been successful or in the same measure. The successfulness of the processes is different. I mean, some countries at the beginning adopted an approach of silver bullet. They tried to use those framework laws to solve all the historical problems they face. Then they went into very complex proposals, institutional architecture that was quite complex and heavy. In those cases, they finally discovered that by adopting those institutions that are so heavy, that try to solve everything, regulate everything, instead of providing guidance to integrate the different sectors, they have a lot of problems to implement those laws. Those that were more pragmatic and tried to facilitate a conversation, try to orientate the different stakeholders, creating a minimal set of instruments for collective action, but not trying to fix everything. My personal perception is that they had better advancement and they have more facility to implement the laws.
Thanks. Can I stop you there for a minute?
Please,
I'd love to get back to you for follow-up questions, but I like it how you bring back the complexity of human rights and law and food systems back to more pragmatic questions. Don't try to, you use the word silver bullet, but maybe you should say cannonball to try and solve all issues at once, but rather provide guidance and be pragmatic in your problem solutions, and maybe even give yourself a bit of time. So that's really helpful. I'd like to move for now to the next panelist, Dr. Lakshman Gamlat from Sri Lanka, who is a medical doctor and a public health expert and a senior manager and educator in health and related system management and health regulation. Dr. Gamlat, I'd like to ask you, could you please describe some of the impacts of the regulations requiring color coding for sugar levels in beverages? It seems to be enforced since 2016 or so, and for sugar, salt, and fat content on pre-packaged food that came into force a bit later. Can you share with us these examples and these experiences from Sri Lanka, please? Dr. Gamlat, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much for giving the opportunity for Sri Lanka to present these two regulations on color coding, which we call the front of pack traffic light labeling. Could I share my screen or just do the description of it? Can't hear you.
No, I was muted myself. If you could just take it like 2 or 3 minutes to share those examples, that would be excellent.
Without the presentation?
I think just without the presentation would do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. In fact, in 2000, as you said, in 2016, we introduced this color coding regulation, the traffic light system for sugar sweetened beverages. So having seen the alarming increase of diabetes in our country and obesity, together with child obesity is around 6%. So the government thought of introducing these sugar control measures. That's where we first introduced this color coding for sugar levels in sugar sweetened beverages from 1st of August 2016. And in fact, the coded the levels for coding was, if it is less than 2 grams, it's the green, then the 2 to 11 grams amber, and above 11 is red. So as we expected, there was a big change in the market after the introduction of this color coding regulation, and there was drastic drop of sales of the big players, which was a very big concern and for them. And in fact, then what happened in the market was that nobody wanted to be red, so automatically they reduced the sugar levels to either amber or green. It was difficult to reduce it from that high levels all of a sudden to green. So most of them gradually reduced it to amber. So that way, I think the country or the people benefited by reducing the level of sugar in most of the beverages. In fact, in certain studies, we have seen that among our school children, 48% of school children consume sugar sweetened beverage on daily basis. So with a lot of sugar. So this had a good impact as we expected, but the negative impact was that the industry started adding sweeteners, artificial sweeteners in place of sugar. So that in fact we didn't like, and we did not expect. But all in all, the other advantage was that this was a consumer information. People got to know that these products had a lot of sugar. In fact, most of those products did not have the sweet taste, but some ginger flavor or some other cola flavor, which in fact used to hide the sugar. So people came to know that the levels of sugar in these high, what we call fizzy drinks, and that was in one way information for the general public. Plus, also it drastically reduced the sugar levels of many well-known products in the market.
Thank you. That's a very colorful example, I would say, using almost a traffic light example as a front of pack labeling methodology. And that helped to step by step or incrementally reduce levels of sugar, because obviously no one wants to be red, or I believe in the Latin America it would be black. So that is really a stimulus for producers. And I'd like to highlight one more aspect of what you said. You mentioned a very specific figure: 48% of children use sugar sweetened beverages on a daily basis. So that also indicates the need for solid evidence, for solid data in order to inform your laws. So thank you so much for that. Let me move on now to the next panelist, Mr. Alan Achese Maleche from Kenya, who is serving as the Executive Director of Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network on HIV/AIDS. Over to you, Alan. If you could also try and share your experiences with regard to how human rights-based approaches can support advocacy to advance public health outcomes. You have the floor, please.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute, and thanking the organizers for allowing me and Kelly to share the work that we've been doing. We have been in a close collaboration with IDLO, our World Health Organization, and the Ministry of Health in Kenya around issues concerning nutrition labeling. And what we have learned as a human rights organization that began on issues of HIV is trying to adopt the human rights-based approach, which is simply put an approach that hinges everything around what is the right of the person that you're dealing with. In this case, the central right is the right to food, or right to adequate food of good nutrition. And we try to look what are the other rights that depend on it that need to be fulfilled for this to become a reality. And so the rights-based approach then helps us understand what does the law say about these issues? And I think the first speaker was quite clear around what constitution say, what legal framework says, who is responsible for ensuring these rights become a reality, and are there any correlative duties that need to be done either by the person to enjoy the right or the person who's supposed to be able to enforce the right. And within that circle, we try to then tackle the problems. If it's an issue of nutritional labeling, then we see the connection with the right to information, the right to participation. And even when you talk about the right to information, you then think through who exactly needs the information. Is it a child? Is it a person with a disability? Have we tailored that information to suit their circumstances? Or are we doing one size fits all? So the rights-based approach then allows you to be able to take into account how best am I dealing with the most vulnerable in the situation, and how best am I working with the principles of participation, accountability, non-discrimination, equality, and empowerment to ensure that we are making the right to food a success. And so it is with this approach that we have begun and continue to work on a project with IDLO, WHO, and the Ministry of Health to come up with guidelines around nutrition labeling and with information that will ensure that the right information is provided to the right audience in the right way. And I think it is important for those of us who are making a step into this important sector of nutrition, this important sector of the right to food, to see it from that perspective. You have to have a legal law that is anchoring a responsibility on a certain person, and we have to have a mechanism to be able to hold those people accountable for us to be able to see the results. It's not a favor, it's something that the law says you need to have, and it's part of very many conventions that countries have signed and ratified and said, we are committed to ensuring that our citizens have the right to adequate food of good quality. So let me stop there and I'll come back later to share the HIV experience, but definitely a rights-based approach is extremely important in terms of ensuring we get our public health outcomes, because everything depends: clean water, good housing, information, education, rights to health are all interlinked and they all drive towards the right to food. And so we have to keep that in mind, that we can't just work on food and nutrition alone. We need to figure out who's doing water, who's doing housing, who's doing health, and how we're bringing them together to be able to meet our goal, which is to ensure that the human being is healthy and is living a healthy life. Over to you.
Yes, thanks. I cannot agree more, I should say. I really appreciated how you're linking the human right to adequate food to other rights, but also making it speak to the rights holders, but also the duty bearers, who in fact have a role to play in order to solve the several problems that prevent people from realizing or enjoying their human rights. And I particularly liked, in fact, how you referred back, even though not implicitly, and not explicitly, but rather implicitly, to the first speaker from FAO, Latin America, who also showed us a bit of pragmatism. So what is needed in order to solve that immediate problem? What is the best way to work with the several principles of participation, accountability, et cetera, in order to practically move 1 and 2 and 3 steps ahead? So let's move on to the next panelist, Dr. VGFSyN from India. She teaches economics at Ambedkar University in Delhi. And Dr. VGFSyN, may I please ask you, how was the strategic litigation and Supreme Court case instrumental in influencing the National Food Security Act, which is quite famous, of course, in India and even beyond India? The floor is yours.
Thank you. There is a public interest litigation around the right to food, which is also quite well known as one of the longest mandamus that has happened in any court across the world on the issue of right to food, which went on from 2001 to 2017. So over 16 months. And the basic premise of this litigation, which was filed by the People's Union for Civil Liberties, was that in the context of a period of drought in 2001, when there were a number of starvation deaths recorded, the godowns, the public stock holding was at its highest. So they used the right to life in the Indian Constitution as the entry point and argued using previous Supreme Court orders saying that if there was a right to life with dignity, then how could we have a situation where the state owns these food grains and there are people dying? As a result of the progress of this case, there were a number of very significant orders that were passed by the Supreme Court, primarily to do with distribution of subsidized food grains through the public distribution system, providing a cooked meal in government schools up to grade 8, early childhood programs, social security pensions, and so on. So the Supreme Court had directions on each of these. They universalized many of these and set minimum standards. In 2013, the National Food Security Act that was passed in Parliament basically brought together these directions of the court. So the act, the legislation that we have in India is very much the third layer, which is it's not a framework law. It is based on entitlements, which the way the act puts it is that it follows a human life cycle approach. So you have the early childhood period, pregnant and lactating women getting a cash transfer, school meals, subsidized food grains to households. But we also, the Act has provisions for grievance redress and transparency and accountability in case these entitlements fail people. And there is a section under progressive realization, which could take us towards a framework law, which discusses, which lays out the other things that government should aim to do, which includes health, hygiene, sanitation, greater investment in agriculture, supporting small farmers, and so on. So what we have currently is an entitlement-based law, but that law also has a schedule which lists out these other determinants of nutrition. I think that's it.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this practical and very telling Indian example. Again, in fact, linking right to food to other rights like right to life, and bringing again to the table the need for accountability, which is extremely important, of course. I like the example also how you bring it up to the Supreme Court. In fact, let me now move to the last panelist, Dr. David Kabanda from Uganda. Mr. Kabanda is a food rights lawyer, and he practices this through advocacy and public interest litigation for sustainable food systems. I'd like to ask you the following question. What has been your experience using strategic litigation to advance the right to food in Uganda, and which challenges you have faced and which opportunity have you identified to overcome them? David Kabanda, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Eke, and everyone. The organizers for having invited me to speak into this forum. We have been working with IDLO on promoting health diets and preventing non-communicable diseases. In litigation, we specifically do public interest litigation, but these are my experiences. When you do litigation in this space, I have now realized that many people, the communities, are missing out on what their rights are. It is not like any other right where the court of public opinion, if engaged, would really work with you in court. And I think this is helping the violators of the right to food in the entire value chain to do whatever they do with a lot of impunity. And I have also experienced that courts of law are seemingly lacking out on the critical, normative content of what this right entails. Many times we've been in court and the judge quickly asks you, what is this right? What are you talking about? Can you point me to this right? And in many constitutions, you don't have this right. For example, back home in Uganda, we don't have it specifically mentioned in the constitution. So every time you must go out of your way to discuss it articulately with the judges. There are too many challenges, including the judiciary itself failing to understand you from the word go, and other people also not feeling that this is a determinate right that court can determine. But we have seen that there are too many opportunities if you do public interest litigation on the right to food. And I think from our own perspective, what has been missing largely is the use of holding duty bearers accountable on this right. So there is a lot of impunity, not only from the private food companies, but also from government on the side of policy making and also implementing at least the laws we have. I'm glad that a legal framework was presented by FAO and WHO. So if we can only hold duty bearers accountable, because we are already seeing, some results coming up. In one of the cases that we've litigated, the judge has acknowledged that although the right is not specifically mentioned in our Bill of Rights, but the right exists and it can be enforced. In one of the cases where we sued government for its failure to regulate sugar sweetened beverages advertisement to children, the judge herself told us, quickly before I finish the case, go and work on a manual, which we have worked on, and now the judicial, at least there is a manual which they can look at to point them to the jurisprudence, because we realize that we do not have enough jurisprudence, so there are not many cases on the right to food. And we have also seen many opportunities are now coming up, because some agencies, government agencies have come to us and they've asked, can you please give us guidance? For example, the Uganda Communications Commission came to us and said, okay, if you want us to regulate the broadcasters, point us specifically to what do you want us to say or to regulate. And I'm happy to let you know that when we are working with the ministry, WHO and IDLO and at least the process, I'm happy Kate is here, the process for nutrient profiling model for Uganda is happening. And it is, all this is becoming because of the litigation that we are having in the country. So
Excellent.
I'll be coming back to you in case we still have time to share more opportunities and challenges. Thank you. Back to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much. I'll definitely get back to all the speakers for a second round. This is really very informative. And I appreciated you saying that, in fact, you referred back to the keynote speakers when you said there is no, it's not in the Constitution. So going back to these layers in the legal framework, it needs to be in the Constitution, and then that's the base of the foundation of where you can start working from. Again, you mentioned accountability. People often do not know, and duty bearers remain people that are responsible, they are not punished. It's a problem. They are not held accountable. So it's really the work you're doing with the litigation, really, again, as I say, incremental steps in the right direction. Excellent. So let's go back for a second round of comments, starting again from Juan Carlos in FAO. If I may, Juan Carlos, back to Latin America and back to framework laws. Can framework laws, in your opinion, be employed for continued dialogues on food system transformation beyond food security and nutrition, to also address sustainability issues, labor issues, health and safety issues of food system workers? So really that broad food system perspective and framework laws. Over to you. And I'll give you a little bit less time than last time, so we can also have time for other speakers and the general debate. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will say yes, and this is what happened in Latin America. I mean, in Latin America, in many countries, we start talking about food security and the connection with other sectors. And now you can see that they are having conversations about sustainability, fairness of the food system. So you start a conversation under a framework law, and then as you are trying to connect the different sectors, you can continue and you can aggregate other issues. Obviously, you have to be, you have to read the political context. It's not that you can do it when you want. You have to use the windows of opportunity to make those linkages. But a framework law can be the basis for a holistic approach to development. And you can revisit the law and introduce an additional item. And my recommendation is use what you have. Don't try to multiply.
Excellent. That's lovely. Again, you're being very pragmatic, and you were saying, use that window of opportunity. Look at the momentum, and you see you have been grasping the momentum in Latin America, because I hear you say that already sustainability and fairness issues are being debated in that context. So that's very promising, I would say. Let me ask another panelist for another question, for another answer, I would say. Dr. Gamlat, over to you again. How did you manage in Sri Lanka? How did you manage Sri Lanka's obligations under international trade agreements when developing and implementing food laws, including the traffic light system? So back to trade again. Dr. Gamlat, you have the floor again for about 2 minutes or less if you can. I can't hear you. Are you still on mute?
Sorry, again on mute. That's again mute. As we, in fact, under TBT, we notified this regulation. And other than this regulation, in fact, in 2019, we introduced the color coding regulation for solid foods and semi-solid foods. That is for sugar, salt, and fat, all three unhealthy constituents. So in both cases, we notified the WTO, and we had some concerns. And one of the concerns I could remember that why not less restrictive measures be imposed rather than going on mandatory labeling? Why not voluntary labeling? In fact, before 2016, for 3-4 years, we tried voluntary labeling. So strange enough that our industry was not complying, and they were arguing and they wanted to change levels and all that. So because we were not successful with the voluntary labeling, only we had to go for mandatory labeling. Then some countries, in fact, question us about how do you arrive at these levels? What is the justification for these levels? In fact, those levels are arrived at through a long discussion with the scientists, the law departments, then traders themselves, the industry, food industry, then the nutritionists, and all the groups together, having discussed for years, only we arrived at these the levels. So these are the concerns of the WTO under WTO agreement, and in fact we successfully answered them, and finally we launched this color coding regulation for sugar sweetened beverages in 2016, and the next regulation for solid foods for sugar, salt, and fat in the year 2019.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting indeed. So basically you mentioned that the industry did not abide to any of the voluntary measures, the voluntary labeling, but bringing together all actors at the table, you were kind of able to provide like a powerful impetus to get these more binding agreements. So that's really interesting. Let me get back to Ellen Maleshe from Kenya for a second question. You're also active in the HIV area. So how can we learn from the HIV experience, and how can it be applied to the nutrition and food system area?
Thanks. Just real quick, yes, we live and breathe HIV at Kerlin, and that's what we started off with, representing people who are living with HIV and their rights. And I think the most important thing we can learn from the HIV movement is putting those affected at the center of the response. And that is what has made the HIV movement work. It is those who needed ARVs, those who had lost persons to AIDS, those who are infected with HIV, were the forefront of fighting for the ARVs, were the forefront of fighting for the right to work, were the forefront of fighting for the right to non-discrimination. And so we need to flip this and figure out who is that is being affected by foods that have got high salt intake or high salt concentration, who's being affected by sugary foods, who is actually the victim of this. And you will find out in most countries, even in developing countries, it's the middle class, those who can afford the fancy foods, those who can afford the McDonald's and the KFCs, and we need to figure out how do we tap them in. And also what we've learned and what we're putting into practice is working with other communities, including people living with HIV, those who are fighting prevention of non-communicable diseases, because you're trying to show the link of what unhealthy diet and healthy food is likely to do. And I think we also need to figure out from a multi-sectoral response, how do we bring all players on the table, those in the academia, parliamentarians, people in the judiciary. It's an entire movement that we have to map through and think through who are the duty bearers and how do we all get them to be concerned about this particular issue, so that by the time you have worked with judges, you've worked with lawyers, you've worked with academia, you've worked with affected communities, you've created an enabling environment that would be easy for policy making, for litigation, working with the media for advocacy, and breaking down information so that people can understand, why should I not pick a packet of crisps or chips and instead pick a sweet potato that is being sold by a farmer on the street? Or why should I do X and not do Y? And I think those are important components we need to bring together. And definitely there are lessons that we can replicate and even improve from the right to food from the HIV response. I think there's hope and we must do it.
Yes, yes, thanks a lot. And you started off with a very powerful remark stating that people need to be at the center. And then you added on that people at the center need to be surrounded, in fact, by so many actors that join hands in order to protect these people and allow them to enjoy their rights, including the right to food, like parliamentarians, like lawyers, like nutritionists. So thanks a lot for that comment. Let's go to India, Dr. Deepa Sinya again. We were speaking about the National Food Security Act. So what type of legislation is in fact this National Food Security Act, and what does it do? What are the gaps? Can you just give us a few examples there?
Thank you. So like I was saying, the Food Security Act mainly has, the biggest component of it is subsidized food grains to about 2/3 of the population, 75% of the rural population and 50% of the urban population, where people are identified as being amongst the poorer sections and they're given what's called a ration card. If you have a card under the Food Security Act, then each member of that household gets 5 kilos of food grains per month at very, very low prices. And so this has been, this is the mainstay of the legislation. Along with this, we have, like I said, school meal and early childhood programs, and we have a maternity entitlement, a cash transfer of ₹6,000 a month. While these have been, these are basic, which keep families away from starvation and provide basic food security. One issue that has been a big gap in the National Food Security Act is that it takes this very limited view of food security to mean only cereal security, and that also in practice is limited to only rice and wheat. So the whole entire issue of diversification of diets, nutrition, where we, like we discussed in the beginning, as healthy diets, as having food from various food groups, the Food Security Act does not address that at all. It does not lay out any standards. In fact, in the context of India now facing a double burden of malnutrition, where we are also seeing our obesity and NCD levels go up, the Food Security Act also doesn't say anything about processed foods. We do not have any regulatory legislations on processed foods and their marketing either. The other aspect that was hotly debated when the act was being passed, and which has again become very relevant given farmers' protests in the country over the last year, is that the act does not have anything for production on the production side and for protection of producers. So in India, while almost half of the population is still dependent in one way or the other for agriculture for a livelihood, over 80% of our farmers are net consumers of food. So you need farmers needing the right prices for their produce, and at the same time, the requirement to keep food prices low. So there is a demand for the minimum support price from the government to procure publicly, and the Food Security Act again puts this under the progressive realization clause and doesn't have anything specific for that. And that is another big gap that we see in the act. So what we have is good, but there are many missing parts.
I see that, and it's interesting. It's the National Food Security Act, and maybe we are speaking about incremental steps all the time. So the base is good, even though it's just grains, and you need to go beyond to healthy diets, etc., etc. So it needs to go, instead of maybe NFSA, the S should not be security, but maybe system, Food System Act, so that you also can include the workers, as you say, and all these elements that are still lacking. So thanks for that comment. Let me go back to our last panelist before we go to the many questions that have been posted in the chat. David Kabanda, could you please tell us what evidence we have of a positive impact of the right to food-based litigation on advancing policy restricting marketing of food and non-alcoholic beverages to children? David, you have the floor. I think you're muted. David, you need to unmute yourself. That's better.
Okay, thank you so much. In one of the cases that we have filed in court, we see too many opportunities coming up already. And like I
We can't hear you anymore. Maybe there's something.
Because
yes,
this
here we
is
are.
not a space which lawyers have been litigating. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, maybe you should shift off the camera because the internet connection is a bit unstable, it seems.
Okay. So we find ourselves that even lawyers have not been, litigating this space, and many of them are now coming on board. The Uganda Law Society has even asked us to create a cluster on the right to food, which is now ongoing. Then law students are also coming on board, and other quasi-judicial, bodies, including the Uganda Human Rights Commission and local governments. So, hello?
It's difficult to hear you. Maybe I'll just start asking a few of the questions from the panel, and then I'll get back to you. Is that okay? So it's a pity we could not listen to the. Yeah, we can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. We have seen many people come on board, and we also have seen local governments also come on board. So we need to continuously give them this information, including informal justice actors, because it starts with communities where malnutrition and everything starts from. Then the cities, many people in our countries are now moving to cities, but do we have sustainable and clean food environments within these cities? Because if we are talking about sugar sweetened beverages to children, advertisement, it affects much those people who are in the cities, but also working with several and other line ministries. For example, we are now working with the Ministry of Education and one of the local governments to come up with circulars to schools such that we prevent that open advertisement to all children. And it is because of the litigation that we have been doing in court. Over to you, Senator. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, and apologies for that confusion in the connection. That was a pity, but thanks again for your contribution. We do have a little bit of time for the Q&A. There's so many questions in the chat, and we will not be able to address all of them. I saw one on food fortification that could be interested for WHO, Katrien, to reply to. Has any work so far been carried out to look at the implications of mandatory food fortification on the right to food of food system actors? Katrien, would you have some short remarks there?
Thank you. Probably the response is not going to be satisfactory, and I'll need to check with my colleagues who are focusing on food fortification. But I think on a global scale, there has not been that much work done, or not work done in that area. And I do think in relation to fortification, it always is important to see fortification in the context of the overall nutrition interventions being implemented in a country, to see how the fortification would fit in, and of course the details of the type of fortification. But it's definitely an important aspect to consider and to shine the light on fortification also from a human rights perspective. So I'll take that up, and I can maybe respond to Florence then also personally, and link her up with the right person who could give that response. But maybe others would want to add who are on the panel.
I'm just looking quickly around to see if anyone would like to take that question. Otherwise, we go to a next question. I did see, we spoke a lot about, also taking advantage maybe of the momentum. And now I saw a question I'd like to ask to Geneviève. What is there a potential for fragmented regulation of food systems and institutional clashes? It's a question from Lisa Obino in the chat. Geneviève, I think that's a lovely question to you.
Thank you. I think what we see here is that we need coherence, and that's what we're trying to do by explaining our layers with, for instance, at the national levels, constitution and then framework laws. I think we need more coherence in all of that. And I just want also to add and take this moment to say that, as you can see, nutrition and the right to health is an important issue, and it's very, it's moving fast in that particular area of the right to adequate food. But we also need to work with legislative interventions in all the constituent elements of food systems. So we need this to be all across the food systems. We need efforts to be coherent and all across the food systems. And we've heard interesting experience, and I would like to thank the panelists for sharing those experiences. And I would also like to add to the brief intervention I did that draw your attention to the resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations recognizing the right to safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And I think this is going to be another a very important step in food system transition, and hopefully it will induce changes also in the other constituent elements in systems supporting food production and also in food supply chains. And we can keep moving forward to change things in the food environment and consumers' behavior. And as Catherine said earlier, I can confirm that there's not much, I think that the answer is not comforting. I think there's also needs to be effort done on all of those topics. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. And I was just thinking maybe Juan Garcia Cebolla, would you like to add to that question as well? When Geneviève was responding, I thought that this also links to what you had contributed so far. I think you're on mute.
I think that we need to facilitate coherence in two senses. First of all, is that all the stakeholders are aware of the connections between the different rights and the interdependence, because many times the judiciary is not considering, for instance, this aspect. Look at national level and doesn't consider the issues of international laws. And second is that the coherence is also promoted by the participation of the different stakeholders. If you are able to really put around the table the different stakeholders and start a conversation, they start understanding the position of the others. And then this facilitates the coherence and the meaning of the law at the end. If not, the law is not meaningful for people if they don't understand each other. Sorry, Geneviève, I see that you want to add something, maybe.
I just wanted to say, I'll add after you finish. I just, you make me think about something very important. I just want to add. So, but I didn't know how to raise my hand virtually, so I did.
Go ahead, Geneviève, but brief.
Okay, I just want to say, well, I'm sorry. I just want to say that the coherence, as you just said, one is very important at all levels. As we said very briefly in our presentation, we need to have this food system approach at all levels, international, regional, and national. So coherence is important everywhere. As I said, an enabling environment, international environment is needed. So states can be free to adopt and politics and regulations they need to adopt to move towards food systems. And also all the work we are doing really close to local markets and everything, and especially in notably in Latin America, it might go and influence international law. So coherence needs to be everywhere. So that's why what we try to recall to states in the study. And also I think the participation, as you said, it's very important to bring that coherence. Stakeholder participation is a key element to bring that coherence in. So I'm done.
Thank you. Oh, I thought I was on mute, so I wait. But thanks. That's really helpful, and I think the two of you really complemented each other. I'd like to possibly we have time for one more question. I'd like to ask to Marlesje. Maybe you could share with us some advice for using a rights-based advocacy with donor countries to leverage investment to nutrition, especially since we are heading towards the Nutrition for Growth Summit this December in Japan. I just wanted to bring us also back to the, this global summit reality that we are facing this year. So do you have any insights there?
Well, I'll try my best. I think the first insight is making a link to any donor country around how this will achieve the SDGs. So we need to be able to indicate how ensuring this right to adequate food of good nutritional standard would mean people live healthier lives, they contribute to development, and it contributes towards the SDG goals. You have less people being sick, and so you're ticking off SDG goal number 3. And I think I'll start from that perspective. But I'd also move from the legally binding perspective of, look, you're part of the countries that have signed and ratified the important conventions and treaties around the right to adequate food. What support, what leverage are you bringing on the table to support those who may want to take that direction, but may have limited resources to be able to do so? What kind of support are you giving? Is it legal framework support, policy framework? Is it a framework that sees the countries also increasing their domestic resource as against hinged money that's being given to them? So I think the conversation with the donor countries who are supporters of the right to food of adequate nutritional value and quality should be a conversation around how is this holistically going to promote the development of individual human beings and bring together greater global good, and particularly achieve the sustainable goals that we've set in place. I think making those linkages from a point of view that if you don't do this, then you're not going to meet the goals, or if we do this, we're likely to meet the goals real quick, and how it connects to everything else from the whole interdependence and the holistic approach to dealing with issues would be one way to go. And I think this would be an easy sell for countries that already adopt the rights-based approach in what they do, like Norway, Sweden, and many other Nordic countries. That should be quite an easy sell for them to see the causation of why it's important to support certain areas. Thanks for the question, and I hope I did justice to it.
Thank you so much. And basically the Sustainable Development Goals, indeed, they're asking for this food system analysis, and that brings us back to human rights, as these are supposed to be underpinning the Sustainable Development Goals, and then bring us to nutrition for growth. What I like you say, Alan, was to bring us back to this indivisibility of human rights. And I've heard that throughout this session, this indivisibility, the interdependence of the several human rights we are entitled to. So I'll stop there now, and I'd like to go now to the human rights specialists of the, or I should say maybe the lawyers of some of the intergovernmental organizations we have online and are co-organizers of this event. We have Catherine Schatz, who is the legal specialist from the nutrition section in UNICEF. We have Maria Chiara Campisi who is a program coordinator in IDLO, the International Development Law Organization. We know already Margaret Vidar from FAO, and we know already Kate Robertson. And I'd like to ask the four of you to share with us one key takeaway message from this session. Let me start with UNICEF, with Catherine.
Great, thank you very much, Tineke, and thank you very much to all the wonderful panelists on behalf of UNICEF. For me, as a lawyer working in the international human rights law space for some time, the main takeaway I think I took from this session is how many practical outcomes we are seeing from the application of international human rights norms. And certainly even 10, 15 years ago, human rights were perceived as something that is aspirational, and they're just these norms that, you know, people talk about, but what practical application do they really have? And I think what's really shifting and what's so inspiring from all of these examples that we've heard today is how they are very much being applied at the regional level, at the national level. They're being translated into laws that are having such a huge impact on people's lives, that are changing the food system. And so certainly from a child's rights perspective, the right to adequate food is so key to that. And we've had some pretty strong statements. For example, the Convention to the Rights of the Child, General Comment 16, talked about how states must take all necessary, appropriate and reasonable measures to prevent business enterprises from causing or contributing to abuses of children's rights, and that these measures can encompass the passing of law and regulation. So it's a very, very practical guidance. And then we're seeing exactly that play out on the ground. These laws are being passed from the Food Security Act in India to the laws that are then leading to the strategic litigation examples that we heard about in Uganda, and in Kenya, really setting out, linking the policies to the rights, to the guidelines, being very concrete about the legal obligations and the rights entities. And of course, in Uganda, where again, we don't have these rights in the constitution, but we saw that a judge recognized it nonetheless. And then, of course, in international trade fora, in the TBT even, this link between voluntary and mandatory systems, and being able to use some of these human rights principles to say, no, it's obligations of governments to ensure that they are protecting the citizens from these, well, from businesses and from other entities, and pushing back and passing the strong laws. So that's sort of my main takeaway, just seeing how practically we are now seeing these norms play out. And thank you very much again.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's so positive and optimistic message. I think that's my key takeaway from what your key takeaway. So let's move to Maria Chiara Campisi from IDLO.
Thanks, Tineke, and thank you to all the speakers and panelists here to make this event happening, and to all the participants for a lively discussion as well. Well, it's hard to pick just one message from such a rich conversation, isn't it? If there is one thing that I would pick out of this discussion, it's really the importance of ensuring a multi-stakeholder and a multi-sectoral participation in the legislative process to transform food systems, which includes communities and civil society, to allow for what we have been speaking about, the creation, this enabling environment to support the legislative framework. So we've been hearing a lot speaking about rights in government's accountability in the human rights language. And indeed, to transform food systems, governments are called to make hard decisions, hard political decisions. Look at what's happening with the implementation of the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition. They need support. We cannot leave them alone. And in this sense, the engagement of civil society organizations, as we've heard today, is essential, both to mobilize political will to adopt the needed reforms, but also when it comes to enforcement and implementation, which is one where the main challenges are coming. And this is the principle of participation that we've been mentioning so often during the discussion, from Margaret in the opening to all our panelists. This is really the core of a rule of law and human rights-based approach. So framing food systems issues as human rights issues allow us, and at the same time requires us, to ensure that communities are given an opportunity to take part in this transformation in a meaningful way. So I think this is one of the points that I want to highlight here.
Thanks so much, Chaire, for bringing us back, in fact, to that power question. And in order to leverage our forces, we need to join hands, right? Nutritionists, lawyers, parliamentarians, civil society. Together, we can make that work. Let's move to Margaret.
Thank you. There is a lot of work to be done. That is my takeaway. It is overwhelming, really. We have so much to do, whether we are working with government or parliament or civil society or international organizations, if we're going to move towards sustainability and healthy diets. It is really a huge and humbling challenge. I do believe that taking a systems approach and taking a human rights approach is going to be helpful and it's going to be essential to doing this. I think legislation is essential if we're going to make things happen for real and not just talk about them. But it's not just to have the law. Law has to be enforceable. And that is where a lot of countries are still struggling, just having the capacity to enforce legislation, whether it's against food fraud or food safety or indeed nutrition standards or sustainability standards in production for farmers. There is a lot of difficulties, a lot of challenges. I'm grateful for all the chat discussions that have taken place, all the inputs from the panelists. I think we have really had such a rich discussion, and I would like to take no more of our time as it is running out. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks for reminding us of, the need to be humble, but then continue to do and address that lots of work that's out there, and legislation being our friend, and legislation needed to be enforced, and the capacity that is needed for that. That's really a strong message. Last but not least, Kate Robertson.
Thank you, Stinneke. And firstly, thank you to everyone, to the panelists, to the participants, for a really interesting discussion. I think for me, mainly at the moment, I'm working with countries, including a number of those represented here, in order to actually develop and implement laws, particularly on the consumer side of managing and shaping food environments. And the thing that speaks to me most from this panel discussion is from Juan in saying, use what you have. I think that it's incredibly important. Laws vary a lot between countries. It's important as a first step to have a look at your laws, have a look at your constitution, see who the duty payers are and who the rights holders are, how those can be enforced, what regulatory pathways are available. And also from that, use that to then decide who you need to involve. So what stakeholders need to be brought to the table at various stages of the policy process. And also, I think as one mentioned as well, look at existing mechanisms. So for example, if you have consumer protection mechanisms that potentially you can use, or inspection or enforcement mechanisms that aren't specifically for the laws that you have in mind, but could potentially be put to that use, where you don't need to reinvent the wheel, don't do it. And also, I think just tapping into other discussions, that through taking this sort of multi-stakeholder approach, which is very easy to say and actually very difficult in practice to do, I think that also potentially allows a much more practical, more feasible and more enforceable law to be developed, and actually allows a food environment to be shaped that genuinely allows better consumer choices in terms of diet. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kate. Well, you wrapped it up so nicely. In the end, it's about consumers having the availability and the opportunity to choose for a healthy and sustainable diet in order to enjoy their right to adequate food, I would say. So we've come to the end of this side event, and I'd like to thank all of you, all the speakers, the keynote speakers, and the panelists for this very, very, very interesting and informative event. I can see that the chat is still alive, and people continue to speak to each other using the chat function. So I hope this is going to continue. The UN Nutrition Community of Practice on Human Rights, Nutrition and Law will continue and will be making use of the inputs of this side event, and will be reaching out to you also as knowledge holders. You are out there and you have the strategy, you have the capacity to really bring this effort, these keys to food transformation, food system transformation alive and implementable. So thanks a lot. I wish you a very lovely rest of your day, rest of your week. Thanks for joining, and the session is closed.
Thank you.